Now, the 38th Psalm, we sing that song. We're going to sing it for an invitation song. Once for my poor sin-sick soul, Christ did every burden roll. And now I walk redeemed and whole, hand in hand with Jesus. The name of the song is Hand in Hand with Jesus. And that's what this psalm then is about. It's got an inscription, a psalm of David to bring to remembrance. Now there's 5 things. At the end of this psalm, I'm going to point out that this psalm will bring to remembrance. But right now, I want it to remind us that sin can make us sick. Now, we back off a little bit. We're not always sick because of our own sin. A lot of times the innocent suffer because of the guilty. We're seeing that over in Europe right now, aren't we? A lot of innocents that are suffering, that have done nothing wrong. It's the guilty that are bringing the suffering upon them. And so that happens, and that happens with when it comes to getting sick too. Every time we get sick, it doesn't mean, oh, there's some sin I must have committed or I wouldn't be sick right now. That's not how that works. But when we read of heaven, the place where there's no pain, no sickness, no death, and we're reminded that death entered the world because of sin, then when we get sick, we can attribute that to sin. Sicknesses came onto this earth because of man's foolishness. And so it doesn't mean that you are getting sick because of this particular sin. But let's remember this. Sometimes our sin can make us physically sick. There's a reason that Paul said the body is not for fornication. And it's a sin against your own body. Because there's so many illnesses and sicknesses that come from this. There's a reason. We're not to be drunk with wine wherein is excess. Because that excess can make you sick. And substance abuse can just wreck a person's body physically. There's a reason we ought to be responsible for our bodies and take care of ourselves. I tell you, when you're a young man, you get the idea you're bulletproof. You see these old men hobbling around and say, well, that's not me. And you'll do things that you will pay for later in life. You'll find out that you'll have ailments and illnesses and pains for things that happened 30 or 40 years ago, and they start catching up to you. And so, just by being responsible and not engaging in indulgence. And I remember a medical doctor, was an elder in the Lord's church talking about the Bible and health one time. He said, we have a responsibility to our fellow man to keep ourselves healthy. Because there's so many in the world that need care, and they don't need to be spending that on us. And we need to try to stay healthy so we can be there to care for others. Well, that's not the only way sin will make you sick. I tell you, sin will make you sick mentally and emotionally. And I know there's other reasons for mental illnesses and for emotional problems. I know that. It's not always attributed just to a particular sin. But when you live with guilt and regret, you're setting yourself up for mental problems and emotional problems. But there's another way sin can make you sick. You've heard of people that have been sick and didn't know it. They thought they were healthy. They didn't realize that their heart failure was about to occur and they had a diseased heart. They didn't realize they had a cancer that was going to take their life. They were living along like everything's fine. They were sick and didn't know it. And that can happen to us spiritually. Because the worst kind of sickness is to be spiritually sick. There's a reason that we call Jesus the great physician. And it's not because of the miraculous healings that He did among us, but it's because of the salvation from sin. He has come to heal us spiritually and make us whole spiritually. And so we can have a sin-sick soul. And a lot of people with a spiritual sickness, they're walking around, they don't even know they're sick. But in time, it'll present itself, and they'll see they are. Let's look at this psalm. It starts off, Lord, rebuke me not in thy wrath, neither chastise me in thy hot displeasure. A lot of people have trouble understanding wrath. I tell you, you become a parent and raise your children into adulthood, then you'll understand wrath. You will understand how wrath itself is an aspect of love. Because you'll grow up and you'll see children and you'll see young people and they'll be misbehaving and you won't like that. But I'll tell you, when it's your son or it's your daughter, then you're angry. And why does it affect you so much more when it's your children instead of someone else's children? Because you love your children more. And you want to bless them, and you want them to have good. And you see them acting that way, oh, it's just so frustrating, it leaves you angry. And that's how to understand the wrath of God. The wrath of God is associated with the love of God. And He is angry with us when we sin because He loves us, and He doesn't want to see that. And you don't want God's wrath. I'll tell you, I used to know, man, one thing I did not want to do was make my father angry, because there would be consequences there. And it kind of helped keep me straight as a young man, because I knew the father would get angry if I did this. And that was good for me. You don't want the wrath of God. We read that God said to Moses about the children of Israel, let me alone that my wrath may wax hot against them, that I may consume them. We read what He did in Egypt. Cast upon them the fierceness of His anger, wrath, and indignation, and trouble by sending evil angels among them. And then we read in Hebrews 10:31, it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Sometimes that's misread, but it's the point. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of an angry God. It's the living God in the text, but that's the significance. We don't want God's wrath. And then we describe how it feels to be spiritually sick, and it compares it to a physical illnesses. Now watch this. Here's how it describes. And you may have felt this way physically sometime, but then look at this poetically talking about a spiritual sickness. Thine arrows stick fast in me. Another translation said they go deep in me. You ever had sickness where it just feels like things are just sticking in you? Some kind of skin disease that just like shingles do that sometimes, don't they? Okay, here's arrows stick fast in me. Thy hand presseth me sore is what it is doing. And then He says, there's no soundness in my flesh because of thine anger. Neither is there rest in my bones because of my sin. From the outward flesh to the most inward part of the bones, there's this sickness and disease. Notice He said, because of my sin. See, this time David is singing. He knows it's because I've done something that has made me this spiritually sick. He goes on in verse 5, because of my foolishness. That compare. Sin is foolishness. And it'll make you sick. In verse 4, thine iniquities are gone over my head as a heavy burden. They're too heavy for me. You ever tried to swim with a heavy burden? You're just going to sink. That's how David feels. My wounds stink and are corrupt because of my foolishness. I'm troubled. I'm bowed down greatly. I go mourning all the day long, for my loins are filled with loathsome disease. There is no soundness in my flesh. I'm feeble. I'm sore broken. I have roared by reason of the disquietness in my heart. Lord, all my desires before Thee, and my groaning is not hid from Thee. My heart panteth. You ever had that heart just race? My heart panteth. My strength faileth me. As for the light of mine eyes, it is gone from me. You've looked in the eyes of the sick, haven't you? Where their eyes almost look like they're just kind of glazed over and they've gone dull. And those bright, beautiful, shining eyes that you knew them before, now there's just dullness in those eyes. It's because they're sick. And add to that, those whom He would depend on have turned from Him. My lovers and my friends stand aloof from my sore, and my kinsmen stand afar off. You know, it's nice to have family and kinsmen, because when all else turn away from you, there's sort of a family obligation. Say, well, you know, I know he's a no account, but he's my cousin. I'm going to go over there and take care of him. But David is saying, no, they've all turned away. Even my kinsmen have turned away. And now his enemies have gathered round. And they're going to try to take advantage of him while he's in this pitiful condition. Verse 12. Psalm 38, verse 12, for those in the parking lot. They also that seek after my life lay snares for me, and they that seek my hurt speak mischievous things and imagine deceits all day long. And David says, but I as a deaf man heard not, and I was as a dumb man that opened not his mouth. Thus I was as a man that heareth not, and in whose mouth are no reproofs. He said, I'm not even going to answer him. I'm not going to reply back to him. I'm going to act like I don't even hear him. I'm just going to suffer this in my own silence. And it's because he's not placing his hope in his lovers and his friends and his kinsmen. He says in verse 15, for in Thee, O Lord, do I hope. Thou wilt hear, O Lord, my God. Now I want you to remember, David had sinned and he had done foolishly. But he knew he didn't make the worst mistake. The worst mistake is to turn away from God. He didn't do that. So he'd sinned and done foolishly, but he had not turned away from God. And even though he knew this was my doings, my hope is still in God. He'll be merciful. He can forgive me. He'll help me recover. It reminded me of 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 10, where Paul said, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. You know, sometimes when everything in life is going great, we got enough money to pay all our bills and to have a few luxuries, and we're in good health, and everybody loves us, and we're happy. And then we really can be weak spiritually because we're dependent so much on ourselves and think so highly of it. It's then when we get sick When these infirmities come, when persecutions come, when it gets more than we can handle, that is when we'll turn to God and be strong. And so that appears what has happened to David here in this psalm. For I said, hear me, lest otherwise they should rejoice over me when my foot slippeth. They magnify themselves against me, for I'm ready to halt, and my sorrow is continually before me. And he made no pretense. He didn't try to say, but it was their fault, or the devil made me do it, but there's extenuating circumstances. No, he had done wrong, and he says in verse 18, for I will declare mine iniquity, and I'll be sorry for my sin. Listen to this promise that we have in the New Testament. 1 John 1 and verse 9. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And so let's commend David. Though he has sinned and made himself sick, let's commend him for taking responsibility for his own actions and realizing it is his sin and knowing to turn to God for his hope. Verse 19, Psalm 38, verse 19. But my enemies are lively. They are strong. They hate me wrongfully are multiplied. They also that render evil for good are mine adversaries, because. Now, why are these enemies after David so much? Listen, they're not after David because of his sin. The reason David has these enemies is because he has followed after that which is good. You know, good people sin, don't they? And David had tried to do what was good. That's what's given him his enemies. And now that he has sinned, he is vulnerable before them. But notice those enemies are there. He had created these enemies because he's tried to do good. And so they're coming after him now. And so David makes this plea in verse 21. Forsake me not, O Lord my God. Be not far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation. David knew where to turn to be made whole. Psalm of remembrance. Let it remind us of these 5 things. The seriousness of sin, the frailty of the flesh, the fickleness of friends, the villainy of enemies, and the grace of God. Isn't that beautiful? That when all earthly things fail and we have nothing to turn to, we can seek God after His Word, and God is gracious, God is merciful, and He will become the God of our salvation. And so we're going to sing the song. Once for my poor sin-sick soul, Christ did every burden roll. Now I walk redeemed and whole, hand in hand with Jesus. In my night of dark despair, Jesus heard and answered prayer. Now I walk as free as air, hand in hand with Jesus. If you need to put your hand into the hand of Jesus, then do that this morning while we sing. Come forward. If you need to, we'll baptize you into Christ. And if you've been baptized and have fallen back into a wicked way, then we'll pray for your recovery. And so, give the Lord your hand as we stand and sing this invitation song.